I meet with founders very often, and I have not met anyone this entire year who can raise easily. The
Yeah.
amount of bleeding everyone has to do just to get a term sheet, even if it's early stage, is crazy to me. I'm like, what? You've been around for a year, so you should be profitable
Yeah.
now? Or when, investors now go, yeah, well, we want to take more than 20%. If you want to take more than 20%, and this is just not even your A round, I just don't know where it's going to go.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey, Gita, good to see you. It's been a few months, so I feel like we got a lot
It
to catch
has
up on,
been.
huh? I know.
Yeah. There's been a lot of drama here too.
I know. What? Okay, what's the drama going on in Indonesia?
We run the gamut from corruption cases all the way to more and more uncertainty and also changes in policies. So it's been hectic,
Okay, hectic, corruption. Okay, well, those are always bad, not advised.
bad.
Bad. But,
Yeah.
if they're coming out to light, it means it's good, right? I guess somebody's catching or debating or investigating. So maybe that's
Mm.
a good sign.
These are the ones we found.
Yeah. There's like this survivorship bias or something,
Survivorship.
Oh, yeah.
Laughing while crying inside.
Yeah. Is that an emoji for Indonesia right now? Well, I think the emoji for Singapore is like determined face, the 2 eyes and the flag.
Well, fantastic speech by PM Lawrence Wong. Fantastic speech for the National Day rally.
Well,
Kudos.
that's interesting because I didn't watch it. So I'm glad you and Indonesia are telling me about how good the
Yes.
speech was, because I was
A
like,
lot of us watched.
I'm going to say this, right? Lawrence Wong is doing well on the global stage. I think a lot of people are listening to him and
Yeah.
reading about him and actually giving me quotes about him. It's just that domestically, most people are kind of like, oh, what does the newspaper say? I mean, okay, now you're jogging my memory. I think what he said recently was like, Singapore is very boring, but everybody trusts Singapore, and that's something that is an asset that people would
Yes.
die for, right? I think I'm horribly misquoting him, and I'm probably going to get slapped with some correction order on how I did that quote. But was that a quote that came from that speech as well?
Jeremy, all I'm going to say is I might want a little bit of boring in my life right now because Indonesia, yeah, sure, this is where the growth is. It is also where a lot of the hectic drama is. And I think if there's one thing we all know about Singapore, boring is great for business. That's called certainty. That's called rule of law.
They say there's this quote, right, which I think they misattributed it to the Chinese. In the West, they say, may you live in interesting times. And that was a curse on people's, it's like, yeah.
Very interesting.
Okay, so what's going on? What's interesting in Indonesia from your perspective at a high level?
Oh, where do we begin? Actually, just now, probably in the last week, Vice Minister was detained or arrested for a potential corruption case, for a graft case, but he was also arrested with 13 other people, and he's from the same party as the president. And the thing is, the sentiment right now for a lot of people is we're kind of going right. And I think it's coming from how many cases are coming out, and not all of them ended up being actually proven for corruption. So the very, very famous one that just happened is the Tom Lembong case, where he was convicted for years in prison for, quote unquote, I am not making this up, potential loss to the state.
What is potential loss to the
Right.
state?
No. If your face and your question went immediately to, what does that mean, Gita? So several other ministers other than him, I think there were 5 other ministers or 6 other ministers, enacted the same rule while he was still acting as minister. The only difference is he's the only one who was arrested, and he was the only one who was given the sentence of potential loss to the state, which is exactly what I just said, potential. But so did it happen? Probably not. But they were really, really committed to putting this guy in prison. And then at the last minute, President Prabowo ended up abolishing his sentence. So now he's free. And the good news is Mr. Tom Lembong is now suing the judges, which he should, right? Because they took him through almost 1 year of being in prison, waiting for his sentencing and his trial.
What? He was in jail during this time?
Yeah, he was not a free man. So this is why now that all these corruption cases are coming out, the sad part is there's also a lot of public mistrust of, is this case real? Is this case just a ploy? Is this case really about eradicating corruption? Or is this another very large corruption case that proves that we deserve our ranking by Transparency International, where we are ranked 99 out of 180 for corruption, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just have questions actually a little bit. So,
You should.
I think my first reaction, of course, is at several levels, right? One is, if you tell me, is there corruption in Southeast Asia? Then the answer
Yeah.
would be yes. So
Yes.
I think every local person in Southeast Asia would say yes. I think on a global, stage or panel,
Right.
then maybe people may not say no. But I think, in our private conversations, I think, we see that at a low level, at immigration, all the way to enforcement actions, to other stories I've heard. So I think whether it exists or not, I think the answer is yes.
Yes.
I think the second part is, if you ask me whether it's common as well for this anti-corruption movement, I think it's also happening, right? I think in China we saw the
Right.
kind of like anti-corruption push by Xi Jinping in his early terms and years. That's eased off. I think Vietnam had the burning furnace anti-corruption investigation, and I think they recently stopped as a new leadership has come in and said, we want to obviously feel like we've cleaned it up enough, one. But two, similar to China saying we need to focus on economic growth and trying to build up a pro-business environment in this,
Right.
a new U.S. administration.
Yeah.
And three is like even Singapore recently is still concluding, kind of like a corruption trial regarding
Yeah.
one
I remember.
and minister, and I think they're still going through that process now. So I think corruption and anti-corruption trials seem a feature in Southeast Asia. I guess where I'm kind of feeling a little bit lost is you keep using the word potential loss to the state. And
Yeah.
so I guess my
That's
first question, if you
a real
don't mind
term.
me asking, is like,
Yeah.
I guess, the thresholds is, did he steal money, which is one, which obviously is a loss to the state, also for personal enrichment. And two is there's obviously a loss to the state, which is you are deliberately making losses because you are building public housing, and public housing isn't supposed to make a profit for the state. And then, of course, the third threshold you're mentioning is potential loss to the state, which I don't really understand. So I'm kind of like, so are you saying that this guy's incompetent, or are you saying this guy was corrupt, or are you saying neither of the two?
It was neither. What they found was they found no proof that he stole any state money or that he took in any payment or grafts. Also, what he did regarding the import of sugar and, the prices surrounding that time frame, other ministers have done too. So the big suspicion is, why arrest just one when you could have arrested 5 others who did the exact same thing, basically? And that was when collectively, I think the Indonesian public saw this as a witch hunt.
So politically motivated instead of
so when you said potential loss, the problem was it was never proven. That's why the sentence came out as a shock to pretty much everyone watching the case, because we said, well, that's crazy. That's saying, you did a potential crime. Like, is this a movie? But that was the verdict, right? And at the last minute, President Prabowo abolished the sentence and the case. So, now Tom Lembong is a free man. But again, it cast this doubt over all other future corruption cases. So yes, this vice minister is out. For the most part, every time there's a corruption case, a lot of Indonesians just think, yeah, most likely he did it. Because you're right. In Southeast Asia, corruption exists. Look, I think corruption exists probably everywhere in the world. Southeast Asia is just one of those places that this issue really blooms, whichever reason. And Indonesia, as you know, has been fighting this for a very long time. But again, there's a lot of trust issue between Indonesians and the data that comes out. And I think that's actually very worrying and very problematic. And I see it as an issue, especially from the communications division of the government. Whichever part of the government. So I'm not just talking about the presidential communications office, but also communications infrastructure, right? Something's going on that there's a disconnect between the government and the people. And that's causing a lot of distrust with whatever is happening. So for example, this is not just about corruption. It's about, let's say, recently Indonesia announced stronger than expected economic growth. So a lot of people, because of falling auto sales, rising unemployment, a decrease in foreign direct investment, were forecasting like, I don't know, 4.7%. And we ended up being above 5% economic growth, which a lot of economists were very confused with. And so we're just normal people. And I think when we're thinking about Indonesian people, in general, it's very important to think of the diversity of people. So unfortunately, there's this concept that maybe people are just between the haves and the have-nots, right? We're either in extreme poverty or they are billionaires in USD. And there's nobody in between. There's actually a lot of people in between. There's a huge middle, lower middle, upper middle class, people who are educated up to high school, up to graduate, people who are professionals, diaspora. So Indonesians are just very diverse. It's not just between the haves and have-nots. And I think this disconnect that the Indonesian people are just very diverse and therefore also have the ability to read and understand the news in various capacities, somehow that's lost. Because basically that economic data came out. There's not a lot of explanation behind it. And people are questioning again and again. Because if you see the economic indicators, I'm a little worried about it, right? Do I think there's been a change in data? Actually, not necessarily, but I wonder what's driving it. And that's all, just trying to find transparency and the explanation behind the reporting.
Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
think there's obviously a challenge for every emerging market, right? And famously in China, I think there were obviously headline figures for GDP growth. I can't remember the minister, the senior leadership was basically saying like, hey, he doesn't trust all of the data that's being reported because
Right. Yeah, I
officials
remember.
at province level were being paid based on
Yeah.
GDP growth. So they were fudging the numbers. So he was using his own internal data, which was looking at, kind of like light sources and intensity and energy consumption. Even in America, I think we had a jobs report and there were several like months where jobs, and then they had to do a
Right.
restatement and they said basically that job growth was not as strong as it had been historically reported because of measurement
Right.
error and so forth. So I think there's a dynamic obviously that it's not easy to measure these numbers and also
No.
these subject to manipulation or bad reporting depending on it. So I think we don't know the answer for that. But I think what's interesting is that we do know that the Indonesia Central Bank is cutting interest rates again.
Yes.
And that was a
Yes.
surprise, right? Because when you cut interest rates, obviously you're pushing more money into the system. You're trying to get growth up, which is I think makes sense. I mean, I think Prabowo has obviously shared that he wants the economy to grow faster. But I'm just kind of curious, like, why is it a surprise from your perspective?
I think it's not just me. I think everyone, when we heard it yesterday, we all went, what's happening? But again, I think the question isn't about is the economic growth data, real or not? The question is more looking for transparency of methodology. Because what the rate cut also indicates to me is that, okay, you want to boost growth and you want to make capital flow, right? You want to have more lending, more productivity, more use of capital. I get it, right? But then again, a lot of business people and a lot of private sector, what we're looking for is just beyond the rate cut. In the end, to have capital go in and out of any country, of any place, you basically just need a pro business environment, right? It's about that. And pro business environment requires rule of law. And rule of law doesn't mean then this is a country where everybody goes into a witch hunt and everybody holds a gun to your head, and see whether or not you potentially lost money. It's not about that. It's about ensuring that the law behaves the same, whether you own a mom and pop F&B operations in remote island and if you are the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar energy company. That's it. Like, I think that's what we're looking for. And so a lot of these things like rate cuts, which is also probably in line with Prabowo's new budget coming out, which is a lot higher than this past year. So the budget for 2026, I think a lot of it is meant to boost economic growth and meant to boost activity. But again, my question will always be, okay, in the end, it's about rule of law. In the end, it's about the structure and the infrastructure of the law and how it's administered to people. It can't be sharp to the people at the bottom, and it can't be dull to the people at the top. That's really where I'm at. So I think, okay, we were all surprised with the rate cut. I get your point. I hope it works. I hope it boosts lending. I hope it boosts bank activity. But again, capital cannot flow unless you have a lot of certainty in the market through equal administration of rule of law.
So talking about rule of law, we can talk all day about macroeconomics and how, the central bank is going to cut
Sure.
interest rates some more in terms of
Yeah,
signaling, all this stuff. And let's
supposedly,
talk about
yeah.
rule of law since that's clearly something you care about. So I think there
Yeah.
are two other investigations other than the minister
Mm.
case, but I think one is the eFishery founder has been detained along with several other
Good.
executives. It's
Yeah.
good, I guess.
Right.
And the two, of course, is a Tiny Hub, which is a prior incident of startup failure and collapse. So those are two different cases. But let's talk about the eFishery one. I think it's a little bit more cut and dried. The recap from my perspective is the Indonesian government detained them and a couple of executives, and now they're being questioned.
They should.
After a collapse of $1 billion agri-tech unicorn and Darling and Champion, and from the regional perspective, it's obviously caused a lot of pain. It caused a lot of global investor distrust in both
Until
Indonesia and
now.
Southeast Asian startups. So, but can you tell a little bit more about your perspective on?
I think in a previous episode, we were talking about how I kept saying, really, someone should detain that guy. Someone should arrest the guy because it sends a signal that you can't just basically rip apart the infrastructure and trust in the market and get away with it. And it was fairly obvious. Also, the guy did a very public Bloomberg interview on this, right?
He confessed to doing it.
I mean, I think the discovery process won't be so tough because there's a very public interview.
It's like, Your Honor, here's a screenshot of the Bloomberg article.
Yeah, here's something that went very viral.
He says he did it on behalf of the farmers from a utilitarian perspective.
Because I wanted to do good, therefore I did bad. I mean, okay. So in a way, it's good that he's sane. It's just that, again, we're all waiting with bated breath with what does this mean? Will there actually be punishment at the end? Will there be some kind of accountability? Or is it just, pat you on the back and say, hey, next time don't fudge the numbers? And so I think also what made a lot of people now jump on the Tani Hub ban and say, yeah, this must be a really terrible case is because the eFishery case just set the groundwork for making people simply not have faith in the Indonesian startup ecosystem, which, as you know, I always believe is extremely unfair because for every one eFishery case, there's also 10,000 founders who are just doing their best, really just didn't mean to do anything and is trying to solve a problem. They're just normal people and they're all getting the brunt of it, right? Everybody's having a really hard time raising. Everybody's having a really tough time convincing the Indonesian thesis. And some of these people have been working on their problem for more than 5 years through the pandemic, through all the problems. And here we are.
I mean, I think, somebody was asking me yesterday, I was like, what is the impact of eFishery? And obviously, I think there's a loss of investor confidence, but I also was thinking about it more structurally. And it was just a fundamental misallocation of all of that productive capital, right? I mean, all of this money that was ESG linked, that was designed to help people have better lives. I think he went into a business that destroyed, effectively by today, I guess 90 cents on a dollar. I think that's one side. But, all that money could probably have been split up 100 ways and become $1 million each into individual
capable
founders that needed early stage capital. So it was a misallocation, not only from productive use of capital to unproductive use of capital, but also is a misallocation actually from late stage capital, I would say, and that could have gone into early stage capital into the next wave of founders. And I think many good faith founders that honestly deserve a shot, unfortunately, will not get a shot.
Yeah. I meet with founders very often. I just met with one yesterday. I'm meeting another one today because no matter what, I was a founder. They'll always be my community. And I have not met anyone this entire year who can raise easily. Zero. The amount of bleeding everyone has to do just to get a term sheet, even if it's early stage, is crazy to me, including for businesses where they're just so early that showing profitability at this stage is crazy. I'm like, what? You've been around for a year, so you should be profitable
Yeah.
now?
Yeah.
Amazing. Or the one saying, oh, can you get to 1 million ARR
Hmm.
within your first year of launch?
Yeah.
Or when, investors now go, yeah, well, we want to take more than 20%. If you want to take more than 20%, and this is just not even your A round, I just don't know where it's going to go. A lot of investors are now asking that. And I think, again, this is why it's so important that if someone's been a founder before, that they also go into the investor seat, because so much of the investor terms that I'm seeing right now is very reactionary, right? It's a
Mm.
reaction to what happened. So they're trying to increase confidence in the Indonesian market, in their Indonesian thesis, which is how they raise the fund to begin with, by saying, these are the safeguards I'm about to do. But some of these safeguards are just, well, they're just very hard to do. Nor are those really the companies then that can then make your returns worth it,
Yeah.
right?
I think I was reading this interesting report by Deal Street Asia, and it was basically saying that VC funds raising from LPs in 2025, the first half of the year, was an all-time low for the past 7 years. So basically, it hasn't been this bad since effectively 2018, right? I think it's an interesting data point. I think from my perspective is that I think one of the disasters from the eFishery side is I think it's also broken a lot of LP trust in VC funds.
Yeah.
Of course, we add high interest rates. Obviously, we have the global trade, tariff, kind of like uncertainty and so on and so forth. But I think this definitely didn't help at all. And I think that's important because I think when you open up the news, I think the newspapers are still talking about, how governments focus on entrepreneurship, the next wave of startups. But I think
Right.
the fact that VC funds have raised so little capital in the past, effectively 1.5 years, I think is a
Yep.
leading indicator that they are going to have very little dry powder to invest in, kind of early and Series A startups in the next, I'll say, 4 years. Because I mean, the money that's being raised today is going to be deployed over the next 2 to 3 years. And I don't think things will change dramatically or improve dramatically in the next 1 year either. So I think basically, I think it's going to be lean times for startups fundraising, seed or Series A for the next 3 years. Yeah. And I don't think it's fully understood yet by founders actually, because they know it's been tough for the past 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously they're fundraising now. I feel like I'm starting to hit the bell now a little bit, which is like, okay, the data's come in. VC funds raising for LPs is all-time low.
Right.
That means
Right.
2 to 3 more years pain. So you gotta, the story is like what, it's like 7 years of drought and 7 years of famine. You gotta know,
Yeah.
how long that
Right.
drought is going to be.
So, as an LP now, one of the things that I try to bring to the table with the institution that I represent is that I also try to explain Indonesia, the region, as best as I can with all of its flaws, but also where the growth opportunities are. And not just the typical, the macros look like this, blah, blah, blah. There are still pockets and areas of opportunity that maybe the average person just doesn't think about, because a lot of LPs are not from Indonesia. A lot of the institutional LPs, right? Not a lot of them are from Indonesia unless they represent a corporation or sovereign or something like that. A lot of LP are actually foreign. And this is what happens also when you invest into areas that you just don't know the context of. So you just see more than 50% are under the age of 40 years old, high social media growth. Therefore, it's going to be high consumption. You need to know the context and the nuance. I say that for every region. I say that about India. You need to know the context and what the government is doing, what public policies are there, why India today is very different from India 15 years ago, the strides they've made to make it more pro business. These are elements that any investor needs to know. And I think for the longest time, unfortunately, there was just a lot of hype and it was a lot of positivity and optimism, not backed by actual understanding of the context of Indonesia. So that's something that I try to bring to the LP table too, because we're responsible for making sure that GPs can invest. And GPs are responsible for making sure that problems can be solved by well-meaning founders. We all have a part to play, right? One is not quote unquote more important than the other, but it does start somewhere. The capital starts somewhere. I think it's that, like, we all have a homework and we all need to do our homework. And for GPs is balancing between, making the requirements so hard that you end up not innovating, You end up just investing into things that our proven track record can make 2.1 or whatever it is that you decide your new DPI should be or your new IRR should be. And a lot of them will just be a typical type of company solving very common problems. But I think this is where the opportunities lie. What about in things that people don't see? What
Yeah.
about in technologies that still have a lot of potential that we're not talking about? Yeah.
One observation I'm starting to make, I think we're the earliest people to call for an investigation to eFishery.
Yeah, it's like detained.
I think the level of GP representation on startups is something I'm starting to notice needs to change, especially at the early stage. And I think what I'm starting to notice now is that I think, let me give you these bullet points, right? I noticed actually a lot of startups, maybe they didn't give up board seats, which is okay, fine,
Okay,
in a
that's
negotiation, that's okay. But
yeah.
I think if you have a board seat, you better name somebody to it, because I've seen a lot of GPs who are not using don't have somebody on a board seat at all. So effectively, you supposedly have one board seat out of three, but nobody's on it. And three is if they are on it, they're not clued in, or they're not, kind of like don't have that very
Insight.
clear read in on the company. And so they seem to be blindsided.
There you
So
go.
there's a lot of like covenants around, like, hey, financial damages, blah, blah, but not very much about this building.
Yes.
The reason why I think I see this actually is because basically why it hands up is like the GPs that I'm starting to see, obviously, I also understand their perspective, which is they're overwhelmed, they're busy, there's lots of companies. Maybe some of them have an index approach is rather than a concentrated portfolio approach. But I'm just saying, like, I just feel like there's a lot of like hand washing after the fact.
I've been thinking that talking about board seats, this is why when it came to the other case, so there was this case with Tani Hub and they arrested people on the board. But the thing is, I've been on board seats before, and I can easily say a lot of board members are not privy to a lot of data. Everyone assumes that, I wouldn't say everyone, but I guess if you don't understand how startups work, there's this assumption that if you're on the board of a startup, you must know everything that goes in and out of the company's financials. No, actually, sometimes not even the CEO is always privy to that, because the CFO is the one who does the transactions, right? I mean, depending on the amount, of course. If it's like a $50 Sing transaction, yeah, maybe there's a good chance the CEO is not paying attention to that, or, that's privy to the CFO. But there's a lot of things that a typical board, especially an investor or a GP, simply wouldn't know. And I think, again, questions on transparency of the case, like what's happening with the case, they say it's potential corruption, potential money laundering. But again, none of us know. To be fair, it's not like Tani Hub did a Bloomberg interview to confess everything. I mean, at this stage, it's a lot of assumptions. But all I know is that it's very suspicious to me why, people bring in board members or investors, because I know a lot of investors are not privy to, the real details that happen inside a company. Because also there are rules on that. It's not always that we're supposed to get the day-by-day play of what happens in a company's financials. So I think, I think what you said earlier about port, I'm very big on not just results. I'm actually bigger on process than the final result. Because the final result is a number that in the end, lots of people can play with. The process is something that you can track as you go, right?
Yeah.
And we're just looking at that transparency of process.
Yeah. I mean, I think the board has responsibility to make sure that your quarterly board meetings are done.
Yeah.
The metrics have been reported. You let junior executives speak, right? To give board that piece, that you get understanding of the personnel movements. I mean, these are all processes, but I just feel like, I'm just looking at it, and I think there's something I see. I think another thing that I'm actually encouraging and starting to think of, and is actually kind of like looking at the concept of operating partners from private equity side. I think private equity, I think there's a very thing like, hey, we are financial operators, and once we buy the companies, we're not going to know how to run a tire repair shop. So we need a CEO to be an operating partner to take care of the business, right? And I think there's a very clear bifurcation. And I think the operating partners is a very strong differentiated niche where they actually have the experience, but also have the trust to actually get stuff done, right? Especially in the US. And I think we don't really see that in venture capital, and especially in Southeast Asia. I think it's almost like looked down on, right? Like a dead end job. And maybe there's starting to be emergence of what I call like portfolio support or management, like associates to support junior value, but not really have any real authority or credibility or experience.
Yep, that's the big one. There's no real incentive for funds to have that kind of operating partner model. That I totally agree with you. Because again, there's still always this disconnect if you have a non-founder
Mm.
becoming a GP
Mm.
and then eventually having to manage all of these companies. So again, for anybody who doesn't know this, a GP can have like 10 board member seats, right?
Yeah.
Depending on the size of the fund, depending on the companies. And most of the time, a GP probably goes to a board meeting only every 3 months.
Mm.
They're not
Yeah.
necessarily privy to every single thing that happens every day. That's not a thing. Sometimes you show up to your quarterly board meeting and you go, wow, you've grown so much. Wait, what's the problem? Right? And then maybe sometimes you end up becoming the tiebreaker for a vote. But it's not necessarily true that the GP will know every single thing that happens every 24 hours. So
Yeah.
I think I think that's where the value of an operating partner, as you said, comes in.
Yeah, I think basically what I was just trying to say here is I think we understand the US approach of like high home runs. Obviously, they still exist, but I think in Southeast Asia, we still acknowledge that home runs are both smaller. The middle class of startups in your portfolio need a lot more support, and your failures at the bottom, right? To some extent, there's therefore a little bit more of a structural incentive towards operating partners to help, lower the load, because in our investing partner, you still got to meet people. And let's be super real, like the kind of person who's really good at hands-on and helping people walk through and say, okay, guys, this is the process to do your board deck. It's a very different person from the person who's going to be doing financial analysis. It's just a different skill set, and personalities. Once in a blue moon, there's some founder who's become a VC who's still willing to do both and door hat. And that's good for them. But I think for most funds, you just need to acknowledge that we can't expect the GP to be superhuman. But we also understand that the market reality is you need somebody to really help them. And we can't do it with a mid-level hotco support manager who's just supposed to be a ticket manager of inbound queries or
totally
occasional talent support or occasional communication support. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that's where the specialization needs to happen.
Yeah, I agree. You're right. No, I think again, funds may also benefit from just having a more experienced operating partners, but there needs to be incentives already built in. And therefore, that's probably going to change the game. That's probably going to change how the ecosystem grows in the future, because the way we've done it until now, it's not always working. Yeah. And I don't know, Jeremy, I think for people like you and me, there's a lot of benefit with us, still sitting in the ecosystem, still looking at things, maybe taking on different roles within the ecosystem, just to bridge that gap. Because I still feel until today, there's just this gap between founders, GP and LP. Now that I've been a founder, GP and LP, I really see the gap and the differences in expectations, right? Yeah. And there's just needs to be better bridging.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's just got to be there needs to be an operating partner equivalent with enough credibility to smear, with credibility and, if needed, authority on either side, but also be able to be a facilitator as well.
A lot of Indonesian founders also keep thinking that GPs are this glamorous job where you just raise a lot of money and then you can invest and you get management fee, and that's so cool. And I'm always like, okay, GP in a way is also a founder, and they're founders of a fund, right? Because they have to raise for something that hasn't existed before. So even if you've raised for funds 1, 2, 3, 4, fund 5 has not existed when you're raising for it. So in a way, the GP is also a founder. And I think if GPs and founders can look at each other in that way, in this in this emerging market, there's probably going to be better collaboration, because people just need to communicate better. I think this is what I've been saying about, whether it's some crazy case, whether it's, data on economic growth, whether it's anything else, just communicate better, just have better process and transparency and systems for accountability.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we all know what an end state is, but the process that we all agree on is we need somebody who's actually has 2 eyeballs to really, focus on it. For a company, I don't think you need 10 or 20 or 40. I don't think we're making them a fractional executive.
Right.
But we're just saying, are they distracted in that meeting? Yes or no, right?
Yeah.
They know how to, like layer and, prioritize and support their companies. Don't get me wrong. I think there are some funds that do a good job doing both, kind of like the board management. I think they tend to be more experienced. But, it's not for everybody, right? And I think it's a tricky part. On that note, Gita, any positive words? Maybe like, is there like a word or phrase that you want to leave this episode with?
By the way, I wanted to add in, that's a trend I'm seeing right now that's succeeding quite well, which is a focus on something, like a we are a fund that does early stage healthcare something
Yeah.
in this region or agri something. And
Yeah.
it's just much more focused. And you're right, it does lead to smaller portfolios, but they're maintained, monitored, and managed in a
Yeah.
much more focused way. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. And I think that's the part that makes my parting words hopefully helpful is, now that the world seems to be getting crazier, actually, what's bringing me a lot more comfort is just this focus on the market that that you've always been passionate with. I mean, I'm sorry, we're back to square one, but just focus on that. And as long as you keep focusing on it and you keep building for what you focus and and you care about, eventually, things will look up.
Yeah. On my end, I guess the phrase I would leave people folks is, may you live in interesting times.
No, Jeremy!
No, but I mean, in startup land,
That's true.
we always live in interesting
That's
time. If
true.
you wanted a boring time, you would be.
You wouldn't be. You wouldn't be there. That's
you'd be
true.
in a
I'm still here.
multinational corporation,
Look,
taking a stable job, and you
That's
know exactly
true.
what metrics you need to have. And I think we
Fair.
all live in interesting times. So
We
I think
do.
there's I'm gonna get butchered this, but isn't it Lord of the Rings quote? Gandalf goes to Frodo, and Frodo is like, "Oh, I wish we didn't live in such terrible times." And Gandalf is like, "It's not on us to choose what times we live in, but we get to choose what we do in these difficult times, right?" Again,
We do.
the quote I gave is totally butchered. I'm probably gonna get a correction order from Lord of the Rings. Okay, all right, peace out. I'll see you around.
See you.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.